"Go ahead," the big man said, and he was grinning when he said it, and he lifted one finger and tapped himself twice on the chest, right on the slab of muscle over his heart. "Hit me right here." The 3,000 people packed into the hall laughed with him because the idea was genuinely funny. A 140-pound man in a black jacket was going to move the greatest bodybuilder in the world with a punch he wasn't even allowed to wind up for. The small man did not laugh. He set his knuckles against that enormous chest, 1 inch out, and said quietly, "All right." To understand why a room full of people who worshipped muscle were about to watch muscle lose an argument it didn't know it was having, you have to go back about half an hour to how the 2 most physically gifted men in Los Angeles ended up standing on the same red carpet in the first place. It was an international bodybuilding championship held in a convention hall the size of an aircraft hangar, and the man at the center of it was the reason half the tickets had sold. He was 25 or 26, from a small hard village in Austria, and he had willed himself out of it with a discipline that bordered on the frightening. He'd arrived in America a few years earlier with almost no English and a single idea, which was to become the greatest that had ever lived at the one thing he'd decided to be great at, and he had very nearly already done it. He was not a meathead. That was the thing people always got wrong about him. He was funny, he was calculating, he read people fast and well, and he had a showman's understanding of a crowd that most actors never develop. He also genuinely believed that the body he had built could not be hurt by a man that small, and he believed it for good reasons, because it never had been. If you want to understand why the smartest big man in America made the mistake of doubting that punch, stay with this, because it was not arrogance exactly, it was evidence. Everything in his experience said he was right. The small man had not come to challenge anyone. He'd been brought as a guest, a curiosity, the martial arts man the magazines were starting to write about, invited to say a few words and do a short demonstration between the posing rounds, because the promoter thought the contrast would be good for the crowd. And it was, though not the way the promoter meant. Bruce came out in a plain black mandarin collared jacket among all that oiled bronze skin, and looked, next to the competitors, like a man who had wandered in from a different planet. Lean where they were, massive still where they flexed. The crowd gave him a curious, polite hand. Nobody in that hall had come to watch a small man. He talked for a few minutes, and he was good, and then he said the thing that changed the afternoon. He said that people misunderstood power. He said they thought power was size, or that power was the wind-up, the big travel of a fist across a distance, and that this was backwards, that a strike was not about how far it came, but about what happened in the last inch of it, and that a properly organized body could deliver more force across 1 inch than most men could deliver across a full swing. And a voice from the competitors' area, warm and accented and amused, said loud enough for the microphones, "Show us." It was the champion. Of course it was. He came forward into the open space, grinning, playing to his crowd, and the crowd came up roaring, because this was their man, and this was their house. He stood in front of the small demonstrator, a full head taller and easily twice as heavy, none of it fat, all of it the most carefully constructed muscle on the planet, and he spread his arms to the room as if to say, "Look at what he wants to move." Then he tapped his chest and told Bruce to go ahead and try it, right here, best you've got. Here is the part worth staying for, because everyone in that hall thought they knew what they were about to watch, and every one of them was wrong, including the champion, who was the most wrong of all. They expected one of two things. Either the punch would do nothing, the most likely outcome, obviously, a small man's tap bouncing off a wall of muscle, or the champion would brace, plant himself, and the punch would do nothing against all that braced mass. What almost nobody in the building understood, and what the champion understood least because he had the most muscle to trust, was that the muscle was not the point. The muscle was armor, and armor stops things that try to go through it, and the 1-inch punch was not trying to go through anything. It was going to deliver a wave, a short, deep pulse of force that doesn't stop at the surface, that passes through skin and muscle, the way a shock passes through the side of a struck bell and comes out moving the whole bell, and the whole bell in this case was 240 pounds of the most developed mass in the room. All that beautiful muscle was not protection against being moved. It was simply more to move, and the more of it there was, the more spectacularly it was going to travel once the force was inside it. And the champion made the situation worse for himself in the most understandable way, which was that he did not brace. He was too confident to brace. Bracing is what you do when you're worried, and he wasn't worried. He stood there relaxed and smiling, chest out, arms slightly open, presenting the target like a man posing for a photograph, which was, from the standpoint of the physics about to happen to him, the single most vulnerable thing he could possibly have done. A relaxed, heavy body is a bell that has not been damped. Everything Bruce was about to put into it would ring all the way through. Bruce set his fist against the champion's sternum, 1 inch out. His shoulders did not rise. His elbow did not draw back. There was nowhere for it to go, and he did not want it to go anywhere. The crowd went quiet in patches. The front rows first, a spreading hush, because up close you could see that the small man's stance had changed in some subtle way that had nothing to do with the arm, that something had gathered in his legs and his back, and a few of the more experienced competitors near the front stopped smiling without quite knowing why. Then his rear heel turned a 1/4 inch, and his hips rotated, and the force came up out of the floor through his body and arrived in the last inch, and the fist did not travel so much as detonate against the champion's chest. The sound was wrong for its size. It was not a slap and not a thud. It was a single deep compressed report, and 3,000 people heard it, and the greatest bodybuilder in the world came off his feet. Not far, not cartoonishly, but unmistakably, and to a room that had never once seen him moved by anything. It might as well have been a mile. His relaxed 240 pounds took the whole pulse of the strike and had nowhere to put it, and he went backward off his heels with his arms coming up and his eyes going wide, and he actually travelled 3 full steps of it, staggering, out of control, in a way that man's body was simply never out of control, and he came down against the posing platform behind him and sat down on the edge of it, hard, with the wind knocked half out of him, and an expression on his face that the crowd had never seen there before, which was pure, total astonishment. The hall made a sound like nothing the promoter had ever heard in that building. Not a cheer, something between a gasp and a roar and a laugh. 3,000 people who worshipped the human body watching the finest one any of them had ever seen get moved across a stage by a man half its size. Photographers who had come to shoot poses were firing on instinct. A man in the 3rd row was on his feet with both hands on his head, and here is where it did not go the way you expect. Stay with this, because the champion sitting stunned on the edge of that platform did not get angry, and he did not get embarrassed, and what he did instead is the reason this is worth telling. He started to laugh. It came up out of him slowly, disbelieving at first and then enormous, the laugh of a man who has spent his entire life inside the science of the human body and has just been shown a room in it he never knew was there. He sat there rubbing his chest, breathing carefully, laughing, and he looked up at the small man with an expression that had no wounded pride in it anywhere, only the specific hunger of a person who has just watched something impossible and needs immediately to understand how it works. Bruce crossed to him and put out a hand and helped him up, the small man pulling the big one to his feet, and the champion came up still laughing and still holding his chest, and the first thing out of his mouth, loud, delighted, in that accent, was, How did you do that?" He was not asking to be polite. He wanted the mechanism. How did you do that? He was not asking to be polite. He wanted the mechanism, and said something about how a man his size should not be able to move a man his size, and Bruce said easily that it was not about his size at all, that it had never been about size, and that this was exactly the thing the champion had spent his whole life half understanding. Bruce said, "You build the body so that nothing can get through it." He tapped the champion's chest, gently this time, right where the punch had landed. But I was not trying to get through it. I was trying to move it. And the more you build, the more there is to move. The bigger the bell, the longer it rings. He said, "Your strength is real, and it is extraordinary, and it will make you whatever you decide to be. But strength that only knows how to resist is only half of it. The other half is knowing what a force is actually trying to do, so you are not standing there relaxed and smiling while it goes straight through you." Watching all of this a few feet away was a third man, a heavyweight in a brown suit, one of the most famous athletes alive, who had come to the championship the way famous people come to these things, to be seen and to see. He had been watching with his arms folded and his head slightly tilted, and he was not laughing and he was not gasping. He had the expression of a man who fights for a living and has just watched a thing he intended to think about for a long time. When someone near him said something about a lucky shot, the heavyweight shook his head slowly, without taking his eyes off the two men, and said quietly that there was no luck in it, that he'd thrown a great many punches in his life and never seen one do that, and that the small fella had just done something he'd want explained to him personally before the day was out. The champion did get it explained to him. That was the part almost nobody saw, because it happened after the crowd had thinned and the photographers had gone. He found Bruce near the back of the hall and did not let him leave for an hour, and the two of them stood among the folding chairs and the coiled cables. The biggest and one of the leanest men in Los Angeles, and the small one, showed the big one the first piece of it, the rooting, the way the power starts in the floor and not the arm. And the champion, who could out-discipline any human alive, absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, completely, greedily, already turning it over for how he would use it. They ran the rest of the show. The champion won his title that night, the way everyone had known he would, and he held the trophy up to his crowd, and they roared for him exactly as loud as they'd have roared if the thing on the stage an hour earlier had never happened. But it had happened, and the man holding the trophy knew it had, and there was a new thing in the back of his mind now that had not been there that morning. He would go on to become, in time, one of the most famous men who ever lived, bigger than bodybuilding, bigger than the movies that came after, a name known in every country on earth. And in the long life of interviews that followed, when people asked him about strength, about power, about what he'd learned in all those years of building the most famous body on the planet, he would sometimes surprise them. He would tell them about a small man in a black jacket at a championship a long time ago, who had moved him across a stage with a punch he threw from 1 inch away, in front of everyone, on the one day and in the one place where it should have been impossible. And he would tap his own chest, right where it had landed, and he would say that it was the day he finally understood the thing he'd been missing, that being hard to move and knowing how force works are not the same, and that the strongest man in the room is not always the one with the most muscle. It was, he'd say, one of the best afternoons of his life, and he was not a man who said that about many afternoons.